Well, quite some time ago, Annika was very little. I don't remember exactly when this was, but old enough to speak up for herself, but long enough ago, I don't remember how old she was, but a little girl, to say the least. And it was some sort of occasion, maybe her birthday or someone else's in the family's birthday. But we were having a conversation with my niece, Melanie, who's an adult and has her own husband and children herself. And at some point in time in the conversation, when we were talking about this gathering we were going to have, Annika said it was just for our house family. And never really heard anybody articulate something like that, but house family, she meant as Mom, Marley, Asher, and Lydia, and whoever else was around at the time, and Dad, as opposed to family. Nieces and cousins and grandmas and grandpas and whoever else, again, would make up our family. So she made that distinction as a very little girl. And we laughed, and Melanie feigned like she was offended, that something would be for the house family. But also, it's remained a joke between Melanie and I since then, because it's actually kind of a cool way to distinguish between, units in terms of the family. And certainly there's a house family where you're intimately closer to, just simply because you live under the same roof. It has nothing to do with blood or station in the family life. And there's extended family that live elsewhere, and so you see them less and know less about them. And so it's a very, very neat distinction. Both equally as important, and you love everyone the same, and you do things together as the grand family, and you also do things as the house family. I raised that tonight and thought about it this month because I think it captures the nature or essence of this statement that I had read from the Reverend Mary Hinkle Shore, who has become, I guess, one of my favorite, second favorite theologians and pastors. Pastor List to be at number one. Mary Hinkle Shore, I've quoted before here on a Thursday night. But this essence of house family versus the extended family is captured in the statement that she wrote that says the church is local and not local. Or she goes on to further say that you think of it, the church is a local family gathering, and it's more than just local. And so you have this dynamic where we can think of us gathered here in the name of Greenmount, in the name of Christ, but at Greenmount Church. And so there are local considerations to this church and this gathering and this body. We're a local congregation as a Thursday night Methodist here on this strip. But we're more than just local. We're connected with other churches, even just within our parish and our community and all around the world. And so you have both of these things to consider, local and more than local. A house family and an extended faith family, as Annika would put it. And so we see this dynamic being played out in this chapter, and we're going to see it over the next few weeks as we study Acts chapter 15. We see that the church is wrestling with an issue, and they have to consider how is it we're going to decide to go forward with this issue. What's really important, or even more important than how they're going, or what they're going to decide, it is how are they going to decide it, and when they decided it. And we'll just start with the easy win right now. The win is, it's the very beginning of the church. This is Acts, the book of the Bible where the Spirit of God on Pentecost calls the church together. And so we're talking about not just the early years, but the early days of the church. And so the church is just getting started and just starting to expand and spread across the land. And we already have an issue, and it's a defining moment in the church. And really, not just that, but the decision that is made is really going to make or break the church. And so that's how important it is before you even look at the issue. And then we're going to look over the next couple of weeks is, how is it that they, and what are some of the things that happened in order that they can make this decision. The issue for them here in Acts 15 is one of circumcision. Or broadly, do people that are being saved by Christ have to follow the law of Moses? And so that's the issue. And we might be sitting here and saying, well, circumcision, I mean, that's no big deal. Certainly you four would say, I mean, what's the point of that? I mean, it's no big deal to us. John and I might have more to say about it. But certainly even in just godly things to think about, theology or whatever, it's like, what's the big deal? Whether you're circumcised or not. And then further, nobody's going to know. Well, very few people would know whether you're circumcised or not. Now that would be a little bit different back then because of common bathing areas and that sort of thing, but we don't have to go into that. But what's the big deal? Well, it was a huge deal. Circumcision was humongous. And it's life and death, basically. So much to the point where Moses was almost killed by God for not being circumcised. I mean, so this is no small issue. It was the law that a male child of Judaism, of the Jewish faith, had to be baptized or had to be circumcised, and by day 8. Now we know a little bit about the Moses, being adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter, and so some of his early days were messed up. And so you would say, all right, well, God should extend him grace for this circumcision issue, but not so fast. And I'm just going to, just to illustrate how serious this issue was, it was Exodus 4 that we learned that during their journey, that's Moses and his family, as they're camped overnight, the Lord met Moses and tried to kill him. So I'm not making that up. I mean, this is life and death. So the law says if you're not circumcised, you're cut off from the family of God. And then in this particular passage, we see that this is being played out, not just being separated, but the idea that God tried to kill him. But Zipporah, which was Moses' wife, took a sharp-edged flintstone and cut off her son's foreskin. Then she touched Moses' feet, which was, really wasn't his feet. An euphemism, that's what we call a euphemism, right? So touched Moses' private parts with it, and she said, "You are my bridegroom because of bloodshed." So the Lord let him alone. At that time, she announced a bridegroom because of bloodshed by circumcision. And so she didn't circumcise Moses. That would have created some other issues because he's older here and they were traveling. Not impossible, but they were traveling, and so but God did extend grace because of the medical procedure she did. I just read that not to make us think about other things, but just to illustrate how important it was. This is not a minor issue. It's major. It's life and death that they've come together. And what has happened is that as the Christian message, as Paul has going outward from Judea and Jerusalem and beyond, they're starting to get into some Greek-speaking places and Gentiles and non-Jewish folks, and so they're not circumcised already. They're hearing the gospel message and they're converting and they're having transformational moments where they're giving their heart to God through Christ. They're believing, listening, and responding to the message, but they're not Jewish. They didn't grow up in a Jewish home. They don't practice any of the Jewish customs, including circumcision, which was the rite of passage into the family of God. And so that's an issue. Paul and Barnabas and others are saying, none of us are saved by the law. We're saved by grace. So why would we make them do something, under the law regardless? And others are saying, no. This is just all part of God's plan, and they need to be Jewish first and be circumcised, and we'll all be part of the family in that way. And so it's a huge deal. It's a huge deal. And so they have to decide because it's come to a head. Interesting enough, and maybe we'll say some stuff about this in the coming weeks, Paul also addresses this from his point of view in Galatians chapter 2. So this is Acts' point of view, this is Luke's point of view. But Paul also has some interesting things to say about it in Galatians chapter 2. I just mentioned that now as an aside. But what has to happen is they got to decide once and for all, are we going to allow Gentiles to come in as they are, based on their response to the gospel, or are we going to make them be like us and follow the law and then respond to Christ? And so this week and next, especially, we're going to look at, so how is this decision made? The very first lesson we learn from chapter 15 is one of the ways they decide this is they broaden the conversation. The conversation is broadened. And what I mean by that is, this is not going to be a house family decision. This is going to be a family decision. So this is not a Antioch decision. So this is where Paul is currently in Antioch. They're getting called back to Jerusalem because the church leadership, Peter and others, are saying, hey, look, this is not a house family deal. This is not a local church deal. This is a connectional deal. This affects all of us, today, tomorrow, and next year. And so that is the first step in solving this problem. Is we're not going to solve it alone. We're going to solve it together. Let's bring the parties together. And so they're going to come to Jerusalem. The elders, the leaders, the apostles, Paul and Barnabas are going to come. Already I can mention Galatians 2. Paul's not real thrilled about coming because from his perspective, this isn't why are we arguing about this? But okay, I'll come. But anyway, the conversation is broadened. This is not just going to be a house issue, an in-house issue. This is going to be a whole family decision. And so this Jerusalem council is called, and people come from all over, wherever the gospel has reached. Leaders from those churches that were established all throughout the land so far are coming here to Jerusalem to solve this together. And then they're going to go out into the world, and they're going to live into this decision. And so this Jerusalem council becomes the first model that we have for a long history of councils that are going to happen every so often, every few years, every 100 years, whatever it might be, where the church leadership gets together and broadens the conversation and says, we've got a couple issues here. The Trinity. That is not meant to be just a house family issue. This is a whole family issue. Let's get together in Nicaea and let's solve this problem. And that's, and over again, that's going to happen. We, as United Methodists, have been broadening the conversation since day one of being called Methodist. And so we start off a new denomination in 1784 in Baltimore with a calling in of all the pastors here in the New World that were out preaching in the name of Methodism. We call them together and say, we have to broaden this conversation. We have to have a family meeting because we have all these little house families out here in the land doing things. Some things we're doing in common, other things we're kind of doing on our own. Let's get it together and let's form an official family together, and we call that the Christmas Conference. And then the next year we have our first book of discipline, and then starting in 1792, so just a few years later, I guess 8 years later, we actually start having them every 4 years. And what we call that in the Methodist Church, where we broaden the conversation and we speak for the whole family, we call that the General Conference. So every 4 years, since 1792, Methodists have been getting together somewhere in the world, America, but worldwide Methodists have been coming to a common meeting to have a broadened conversation about issues that affect the whole church. And so that is part of our history. And So we didn't just make that up and say, hey, let's have some meetings together. They traced all that back to that's how the early church made decisions about the whole church. And so that's something that has been very important to us as Methodists since day one. And it's holy conferencing, having good counsel about matters that affect the whole family, not just the local churches. So each individual house family or each individual church gets to make plenty of decisions about how we're going to worship at what time, and whether we're going to have a Thursday night service, and what color we're going to put on the altar, and the style of music we're going to have, and whether the preacher is going to wear a robe or a sweatshirt, those sorts of things. Whether you're going to have a parsonage or allow the preacher to live somewhere else. So the house family gets to make plenty of decisions, just like we do in our own families. But there are going to be some common decisions that we have to make as a broader church, and broader statements that we need to make where we have to broaden the conversation, and we do that every 4 years in the General Conference, with some exceptions. And we have an exception that's coming up. The exception is every once in a while we have a special General Conference that doesn't fall within the 4 years. Same concept, it's a family decision outside the house family, that we have to come together and say we got to make a decision, an important decision about a matter, and let's get together and do it. And so this month, February, at the end of the month, we're going to have a special General Conference on to decide, hopefully, decide once and for all on the full inclusion of LGBT persons into the life and ministry of the church. And so the way we're going to do that as Methodists is broaden the conversation. And so right now in practice, what is happening too often and in too many cases is those decisions are being made in the house family. And so one particular church will do this, one particular church will do that, another church will do that, and it's becoming confusing and hurtful and outside of the way we normally do things. And so we finally said, hey, look, we got to make a decision together as a broader family and broaden this conversation, and that's what we're going to do. And so we need, as we think about prayers, we need to be prayerful as those decisions will be made. And we'll say a little bit more each week about the nature of our conferences and how and what exactly will take place and who gets to be there and who gets to vote. We don't want to give it to you all tonight. But just want to say that one of the things we're doing is broadening the conversation. And we're going to do that this month. And so this Jerusalem Council, we're going to dive into next week and the week after and the week after and see some more principles about what it means to have a good council to make an important decision about the family of God in terms of the way we're going to live into what we call the church, not just the local church, the house family, but also the broader church, the family of God. And we're going to use this council to help us learn more about how to be more effective in our decision making here on the local level and as the broader church. But for now, we're thankful that the early church didn't make these decisions alone or individualistically. They did it by broadening the conversation and coming together and having the courage to sit around and listen to one another, see where God was at work in their lives and the life of the family. Let us pray.